grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. This story about the two disciples on the road to Emmaus on the day of resurrection is a story that really tries to make sense of what the resurrection is all about. Earlier in the day, the women had gone to the tomb and found it empty and brought back their story, and the rest of the disciples who heard it thought it was nothing but an idle tale. And so we begin to see, as the gospel unfolds, the disciples beginning to fracture and break away, and these two disciples are just simply going home. It is over for them. The tale is just too fantastic to be real. And if we are honest with ourselves, we too have difficulty believing these stories. After all, we are modern people who live in a modern world. We're imbued with scientific knowledge greater than the ancients had, perhaps, and we know that dead bodies just don't get up and walk off. And so as we try to live our Christian faith and understand who we are in this modern world, we try to sort of rationalize what we learn from the stories of the Gospels. And we'll often look at miracles and try to find a reasonable explanation for what happened. I mean, one of the most famous ones, of course, is the feeding of the 5,000. Did Jesus produce food and water out of nothing? No, we sort of go... others had food with them, they just had it privately and were shamed or inspired to share it. That's how come so much food was sort of left over. And we begin to sort of rationalize things like that. We turn Christianity into nothing more than a mere moral or ethos, a way of living life faithfully before other people that is good and upright. The problem with that is that it begins to reduce Christianity to just sort of a lifestyle instead of an encounter. Truth is, if we did not have the stories of the resurrection, we would not know anything about Jesus. Because there have been countless numbers of healers and exorcists and miracle workers who have lived in the world before us. And there have been countless numbers of teachers of ethics and morality who have taught the good life, who have also lived before us, but we know nothing about them. The resurrection is what makes Jesus different. And we have to confess and we have to own that the resurrection defines who we are as a Christian people. And so we are like the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, going home, trying to figure out what these stories mean. And if we get to that point, asking, what do these stories mean? Then we are beginning to ask the right question of these stories, because it is about meaning. It's not really about facts. You can look at all the gospel accounts of the resurrections, put them side by side, and not one of them will agree on substance or sequence or who was there. These are stories that are trying to make sense of the reality that Christ certainly did die on the cross, but also of the reality of the church's continuing experience of the powerful presence of the Spirit of Jesus Christ in its mission and in its life after that. How do you reconcile that? Christ has died, and yet somehow we understand Christ is alive. Something that these stories do is give us a perspective for how to live into that. And this story in particular, the story of the disciples going to Emmaus, is the longest of the resurrection stories and is extremely rich. But there are two things in this story that I think are worth lifting up and mentioning. And the first is that we, as Christians, because we are a resurrection people, live and understand life differently. And I'll show you what I mean. As the disciples were walking to Emmaus, they were rehearsing with each other the events that they had experienced over the past week. And certainly, if you look at that whole panoply of experiences, it was an incredible progression of theater. Beginning on Palm Sunday with the farcical pantomiming of parades. I mean, there's the great ones, Herod and Pilate coming in to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover, surrounded by their soldiers, bristling with spears. And what does Jesus do? He parodies them. It's a clown show. And he rides in on a donkey, making fun of the great ones, surrounded by his supporters who are bristling with spears made of palm branches. Totally harmless. Laughter. The second act is a theater in the round that happens in the temple, where Jesus upsets the tables of the money changers and drives the animals out, creating a riot. And the point there is to say to the ruling elite, you may control the temple, but you are not in control of what goes on. You really have no real power. And then the third act goes into a psychodrama. And here, as I read these stories of Jesus arguing with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the temple authorities, the image that comes to mind is that wonderful film from 1957, 12 Angry Men, as they're arguing around the table of what truth is. And it's not resolved, except at the fourth act, which turns into a romantic tragedy, with Jesus gathered with the disciples in that upper room on Thursday night, celebrating what they know is their last meal together because the train wreck is about to hit. And indeed, it does with his arrest, crucifixion, and death. And if you look at the story that way, which is certainly the way the disciples on the road to Emmaus were looking at it, then this is a story that moves from farcical fancy to tears and dust and ashes. But that's not the way that the stranger who comes alongside of the two disciples begins to look at it. And he begins to explain the story that they have lived from a different perspective. One that is based on hope. One that looks for salvation and redemption as the markers, as the lens through which to look at these stories, and they begin to realize that what they have lived through is not a dead end, but the beginning of something wonderful. Early in my adulthood, I knew that I was going to go into ministry. And so when I was at university as an undergraduate, I intentionally studied comparative religion and took cultural anthropology classes to encounter other lesser spiritual traditions. And here's one thing that I gleaned from that study. Most of the other religions in the world are religions of fatalism. They understand that what the human life and what the human journey is about is being born, and as we grow up, is one of embracing life. And then once we reach adulthood, the task is not then to sort of hang on to life, but to begin to let go of life and proceed towards death with some dignity and some decency. And that's it. Christianity has a different viewpoint. Christianity fully embraces life and continues to embrace life and understands that life is resurgent, that life conquers death. And because we see differently, we are able to act differently and make a difference in our world instead of just passively standing by and letting things be. We do not understand the world and systems to be running down. We understand that we are filled with new life. The second thing that comes out of this text for me is the importance of community. Again, as I look around the major religions of the world and the major spiritual traditions, one of their insights is that our spiritual journey is one that is traveled alone. We may indeed have companions along the way who maybe give us advice, come alongside of us for a while, but eventually they leave. But fundamentally, the great decisions that we make in life are ours alone to make. And we have to make them almost in isolation, whether that is to become the hero, whether that is to become the villain in life, or whether that is to simply be an innocent bystander. And as I look at the great traditions and how they structured their religions, and I especially look at the temples and the shrines of East Asia, there's something about those things that are missing when you look at our spiritual tradition. None of those places have a congregation. What people do when they go to shrines is they go to the great festivals and they go to mark the wonderful passages through life, that are rites of passage, the birth, marriage, death, sickness, coming into adulthood. And if we look at what's going on here in America, especially since 9/11, we are seeing much the same pattern. That folks come to church only for the great festivals of Christmas and Easter, and to mark the time of passage through their lives through significant transitions. And if you're one of those people, I'm not knocking that. That is a very valid spiritual place to be. And I'm glad that you are here today. But Christianity has more to offer. More than just marking and punctuating our lives until we die. This Tuesday night, I am going to be having dinner with some friends I haven't seen for 30 years. 30 years ago, I graduated from Eton Seminary and immediately left to my homeland, which is the Mountain West and the Pacific Northwest. And on Tuesday, I'm going to see some folks I haven't seen since graduation. When we were at Eton together, we formed a community that we called the J Squad because all of our names just happened to begin with J. I also only happened to be the only guy, so it was a very feminist group, which I didn't have a problem with at all. But there was something really special about that group. It had a very high sense of social justice. And any time we saw something going wrong in the seminary or somebody being mistreated, we as a group would march over to the president's office and let the president know exactly what we thought. We also ate together every night. And we shared our lives, and we shared our hopes, and we shared our dreams, and we created community. And as we did this, week in and week out, we found that in the midst of our community, something greater than us was growing. Well, certainly the seminary agreed with that, because after we graduated, they heaved a huge sigh of relief. And I've heard that ever since then, that awful, rebellious J Squad was really going to hijack the seminary. We just needed to get rid of them. But here we are, we're going to gather together again on Tuesday, and I anticipate that it's going to be more than just the 8 of us getting together. That there will be some intangible presence and power that is life-giving and transformative in that room, because that's what it was when we were there. The story of the road to Emmaus also anticipates that. When they get to Emmaus, the 2 disciples, I mean, they're good followers of Jesus, they remember that Jesus was all about sharing food, especially with those who did not have it, especially with the stranger, and extending extravagant hospitality. And so they do. They invite the stranger in, and they sit down, and in breaking bread together, it's not just the 3 of them there anymore. In their midst, they recognize the risen Christ, that is life-giving and transformative, and it is such a powerful experience that journey that took them all afternoon to walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus, they run in a matter of minutes back to tell the disciples what they have seen. Christian community is an incredibly powerful thing. By myself, I may be able to feed a hungry person. But together, imbued with the Spirit of Jesus, we can address hunger. By myself, I can live insofar as it is possible at peace with those who surround me. Together, in Christian community, we can become peacemakers. Christian community is incredibly powerful and life-giving. And so these stories of resurrection are really at their basis stories of life, stories of transformation, stories of God's Spirit welling up within the community and making possible what seems to be impossible, affirming that life goes on and on and on, and that the dance of life goes on, and that the Lord of the dance is our risen Lord, Jesus Christ. May God bless you all this Easter season.